So now I'm going to talk about the various bones that you'd find in the skeletal system. I don't have this included in the study guide because you need to be able to identify their location by looking at pictures of the bones. The pictures that you're going to see are not color pictures. I'm going through this PowerPoint just to explain the location of the bones, and seeing these color pictures usually helps people figure out what the actual definite lines or boundaries of those bones are. But you will have to identify black and white pictures of these bones. And that's why lab time we're going to spend trying to learn all of these bones. So we start by going through some of the bone markings, projections, processes, and depressions and openings, because some of these will come back as we go through what all of these bones are later. So a condyle is a bump on a bone. An epicondyle is a bump above a condyle. A head would be the top of the bone. A facet is a smooth, flat surface of a bone. A crest is a ridge on a bone. A process is anything that sticks out or protrudes from the bone. A spine is a long, narrow process. A tubercle or a tuberosity is a rough bump that usually serves as a point of muscle attachment. And a trochanter is also a large, rough bump, and it can serve as a point of muscle attachment. As far as depressions and openings go, a foramen is a hole. A fossa is an indentation or a cavity. A meatus is a canal-like opening. And a sinus is a cavity within a bone. Okay, so now I'm going to just go through the bones of the skull. So of the major skull bones correspond to major lobes of the brain as well. So we have this bone highlighted in yellow is the frontal bone. It's the forehead. And then this specific part of the frontal bone is called the glabella. So that's the brow ridge. There's two parietal bones, a left and a right parietal bone. And this highlighted here is the right parietal bone. The occipital bone is in the back of the skull. And there's specific parts of the occipital bone. So the back of the skull goes all the way to this underside here, and this is all part of the occipital bone as well. The highlighted regions are called the occipital condyles of the occipital bone. Foramen magnum. Foramen is a hole, magnum means big, so this literally means big hole. The foramen magnum is this big opening for the spinal cord to go through. The jugular foramen. So when you look at the bottom of the skull, you see lots of different holes. And I'll go back to this picture here because you can see all of the different holes here. The jugular foramen are the posterior facing holes that are right next to the occipital condyles, while the carotid canals are just anterior to that. So jugular foramen, carotid canal. And here you can see on the underside, the jugular foramen are highlighted here in blue. And that's the opening for the jugular veins. And jugular veins are the large veins that run along the neck, and they're going to drain the blood from the skull or from the brain. Temporal bones are on the sides of the skull, so you have a left and right temporal bone. Some specific parts of the temporal bone. This indentation here is known as the external auditory meatus. That's what your ear canal is. The mastoid process sticks down here. That serves as a major point of muscle attachment for head rotation. So that's the mastoid process. The styloid process. Styloid kind of sounds like a stylus to me. And a stylus is something that you write with. So when we're talking about styloid processes, they're usually sharp points. And here's the styloid process underneath the skull, and here you can see it on an actual full skeleton here. But there's many styloid processes in the body. So we'll learn a couple more of them as we go through here. The zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So this is where it gets a little confusing. So this region here is known as the temporal bone, while this region in front here is known as the zygomatic bone. Now there's a place where they come together, right here in the middle, and you can actually see this line. It's like a squiggly line that connects them together. When we're talking about the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, we're talking about the temporal side that touches the zygomatic bone. So we're talking about this region right here that touches the zygomatic bone. There is also a temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and we'll talk about that one once we get to the zygomatic bone. The mandibular fossa is the indentation under here where the mandible would sit. Carotid canal. Again, if you remember, the jugular foramen are right here next to the occipital condyles. And then the carotid canal are these openings here. So they're just anterior to the jugular foramen. And the jugular foramen are way wider than the carotid canal. The carotid canals house the carotid arteries, and they're more narrow because arteries are more narrow in order to keep the pressure in the arteries. The veins are just draining all the blood, so they're really wide and there's not a lot of pressure that you'd find in the veins. So here you can see the proximity of the carotid canal and the jugular foramen. The sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone kind of looks like a butterfly. It does touch the outer sides of the skull, but it's kind of easy to see inside here. So this butterfly-like shape, and here you can see the body, that's the sphenoid bone. This region here is known as the SELLA TURCICA of the sphenoid bone. When the brain sits inside of the skull, this is actually the bone region that houses your pituitary gland. So this is what the sphenoid bone looks like if you were to pluck it out of the skull. The sphenoid bone has greater and lesser wings. The greater wing actually extends to the outside of the skull and makes up the back portion of the eye cavity, while the lesser wing is right up here. So looking inside of the eye, here you can see the greater wing highlighted, and the greater wing goes all the way to the outside of the skull. The lesser wing is this region right up here, so this narrow region here. So this is the lesser wing, and then this and this is part of the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. So looking into the right eye, you can see the different regions and the different bones that make up the eye socket. Now we have the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is just behind the nasal bone. In ancient Egyptian times, when they used to mummify bodies, they used to break up through the nose and get in and swish the brain around and get the brains out through the nasal cavity. They would have to break through this ethmoid bone in order to do that, to mummify the bodies. If you've ever heard of the brain-eating amoeba, so Naegleria fowleri, where you go swimming in natural bodies of water and water splashes up into your nose and gets into your brain, it's that amoeba, that's parasite that gets into your brain, not necessarily the water itself. But what that amoeba does is it attaches to the cilia inside of the nasal cavity and it burrows right into your brain, right through your nose. It has to pass through the ethmoid bone. Other than being used for mummification and giving you crazy parasitic diseases, this ethmoid bone holds all of your olfactory cilia. So olfactory is talking about your sense of smell. All of those nerve endings that go through this bone are going to be able to trap chemicals in the nasal cavity, and that's what gives you your sense of smell. There's two major plates that you'd find in the ethmoid bone. The cribriform plate is at the top, and the perpendicular plate goes perpendicular. Here you can see where the cribriform plate is, and here you can see those olfactory neurons coming into the nasal cavity. I want to show you this picture again because right here is part of the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and you can see all of these olfactory foramina, or these tiny holes that are going to allow those neurons to go through. So if we look inside of the nose, remember that this is the greater wing, and it goes up to here, of the sphenoid bone, up to here. This is part of the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, above this little slit here. And then looking inside the nose, this top part is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Now this bottom ridge is a different part. It's actually part of the VOMER, but this is the perpendicular plate. And here you can see the perpendicular plate is on the top and the VOMER is on the bottom. From the underside, you can see the VOMER here, and then from the inside of the nasal cavity, you can see the VOMER down here. The mandible. The mandible is the lower jawbone. There's a few different parts. The ramus of the mandible is kind of this angular region. The mandibular condyle is right here. It sits in the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. The mandibular foramen, these are tiny holes on the inside of the mandible, and there's one here, and then there's one on the inside over here, and that allows for nerves to get to the bottom teeth. Alveolar processes of the mandible, that's where you have the ridges that come up here to support the teeth. Mental foramen, if you remember where the mental region in the body is, it's the chin. So the mental foramen are these tiny holes that you find in the chin. The maxilla is the upper jawbone, and here you can see it highlighted in green. It actually makes up the outside edge of the nose region, inside a part of the eye socket, and then all the way in the front side of the face. Just like the mandible had alveolar processes, so does the maxilla, because you have lower and upper teeth. So alveolar processes are going to hold the teeth. The zygomatic bone, that's your cheekbone. So here you can see it highlighted in blue. You have a left and right one. So here's the right side of the face, here's the left side. Looking inside of the eye now, you can see again, this is the greater wing of the sphenoid bone that goes to the outside. This is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. And then we have the ethmoid bone that you can kind of see here a little bit in orange. This is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. This is the VOMER that comes up here. This big yellow one is the frontal bone. The mental foramen you can see here in the chin of the mandible. Here's that temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So we had a zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Now we have a temporal process of the zygomatic bone. The nasal bone is right here. So if we go from front to back, we have the nasal bone, then the maxilla, then we have this lacrimal bone which houses the tear duct, and then we have the ethmoid bone, and then we're going to have the sphenoid bone. So again, that lacrimal bone here, the lacrimal bone, lacrimal is referring to the tear ducts. So a lacrimal canal is a little opening here, that's going to drain the tear ducts from the eyes, and that drains right into the nose. So when you do get that in the nose, it's going to evaporate every time that you breathe. When we cry and we have excess tear production, the tears are actually produced in lacrimal glands up in the corners of the eyes, and then they flush the eye. But when we have excess tear production, it's going to flush all of that excess fluid into the nose, and that's why sometimes you get a runny nose when you're crying. The palatine bone. So the palatine bone makes up the hard palate. It's just behind the maxilla. Looking at the bottom of the skull, just as a review, we've got the occipital condyles, we have the jugular foramen, and the carotid canal. And then this is that foramen magnum. This is all part of the occipital bone. So talking about some of the dividing lines of the skull, highlighted in red here is the coronal suture. If you remember what the coronal plane of the body is, it separates front from back. The coronal suture separates the frontal bone from the parietal bones. The squamous suture. If you remember what a squamous-shaped cell was, it was a flat or egg-shaped cell. This irregular edge here kind of looks like a squamous shape, so we call it the squamous suture. This is going to separate the temporal bone from the parietal and occipital bones. The sagittal and lambdoid suture. The sagittal suture separates the left and right parietal bones. The lambdoid suture is in the back of the skull, kind of around the occipital bone, and it separates the occipital from the parietal bone. Kind of looks like the shape of a football to me. When I think of football, I think of Lambeau Field, because, you know, obviously we're all Packer fans up here, and Lambeau Field kind of sounds like lambdoid suture in a way, if you stretch your imagination. So that's how you can remember the occipital bone, back of the skull, and it kind of looks football shaped.